Welcome back to the Sense of Security podcast. I'm Cassidy Clement, Senior Manager of SEO and Content at Interactive Brokers. And today I'm your host for the podcast. Our guest is Chris Ketchy, Senior Contributor and Stock Market Reporter at Benzinga. The sports industry can be considered an economic force. It makes up a lot of consumer spending from equipment, apparel, experiences, and even live sports. So, how do we see this translate into financial markets and strategies? In this episode, we're going to explore all of that and more. Welcome to the program, Chris.
Hi, Cassidy. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So, since this is your first episode, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your background and how you got started and what your exposure is to the sports stock industry?
Yeah, for sure. So I have been with Benzinga full time since August 2020. I was previously a restaurant manager for over a decade. Always wrote about stocks part time for various media outlets. And then during COVID, the work from home environment allowed me to transition into a full time role with Benzinga. Took a chance, got out of the food industry, and came into financial media. And I've loved it ever since. I'm an avid sports fan here in Michigan. So I love my Detroit based teams and the University of Michigan. And I love writing about anything about sports, whether it's the business of sports or the recent Super Bowl as well.
And that's perfect. I'm an avid Phillies fan, diehard. Baseball season, will find me on the couch with the dogs, watching like an old lady with her coffee, just getting ready for the first pitch. But when we go into this now, it's interesting that you bring up your time as like a manager in the restaurant industry because those get directly impacted by sports and live events. People want to go out and celebrate and enjoy themselves. So, with our listeners coming in here for a financial perspective, what companies would our listeners be familiar with? Because the industry can impact a lot of other areas than just your standard issue television, equipment, apparel, experiences, live sports, restaurant industry, hotels, etc.
Yeah, within the sports industry, there's several different subsectors. You mentioned equipment and apparel. I would venture most of the listeners are familiar with some of the bigger names like your Nike, your Under Armour, your Adidas. You do have some of the newer companies like an On Holding that makes footwear. They have a deal with Roger Federer. They're starting to disrupt Nike's business model a little bit. You have Amir Sports, which recently went public. They own Wilson, Louisville Slugger, and some of those equipment companies for various sports. Then you have public sports teams, but not a ton of them. But there's Manchester United, a soccer team in England, Madison Square Garden Sports, which owns the New York Rangers and the New York Knicks, Rogers Communications in Canada, which owns the Toronto Maple Leafs, Toronto Raptors. You've got Liberty Atlanta Braves, which owns the Atlanta Braves. You mentioned baseball, obviously, there. And then you've got Formula One, the racing league, which is public as its own ticker. There's some various options there for sports fans to get exposure. And then also you've got your sports betting companies, DraftKings, FanDuel, MGM Resorts. And then one of the bigger names in sports is obviously ESPN, which is owned by the Walt Disney Company. So it's a smaller unit within that media conglomerate, but obviously one of the biggest pure play sports names out there.
Yeah, and for those listening who are a skier, snowboarder like myself, Vail Resorts is a huge one when it comes to winter sports. That's a public company along with a few handful of other like media networks. You mentioned ESPN, Sirius XM, where there are sports channels all of the time. For those traveling in your car who want to listen to sports coverage the day after the game, I know that's myself as I commiserate with my other Phillies fans as the games in last year's playoffs didn't go as we wanted. But you mentioned all of these different elements and they all come together to arrange some type of sports impacted economy or the sports economy. So what are some ways that they would impact economies when you're at the stadium or maybe if you live in an area where there is a sports team? I immediately think of the local economy to wider economy. You start to see a stadium come in, let's say for a minor league baseball team, and then the restaurants pop up and then the hotels pop up. Where on a bigger scale, maybe if you have something like a Yankee stadium, it might be so large that they can also hold concerts there. What are some ways that listeners may see these economic impacts?
Yeah, for sure. Just piggybacking off of some of the restaurant and hotel ideas there, I think Las Vegas is a good example. Las Vegas was traditionally known as the casino, the tourist destination, and now you have multiple pro sports teams there. So now you're seeing these hotels get booked for every weekend throughout the year, not just for people going to the casinos. But on that note, you have people making trips who are going to a sports contest, then they're also going to a casino. They're going to the restaurants within that city. And that happens all of these different cities. I like your mention of minor league sports teams because obviously that has a much bigger impact on the local economy with these sports teams, all those home games that happen throughout the season, depending on which league it is, how many home games there are. But you also have the sponsorships, the stadium deals. Like SoFi has the rights to the stadium in Los Angeles. Then they had a Super Bowl there. They got that immediate kind of impact of having their name on it. You have jersey sponsorships, especially over in Europe, where you have these soccer teams with a ton of sponsorship logos on them. NBA and some of these other leagues also started having the smaller patch logos and sleeve logos, and they advertise. And yourself as a Phillies fan, maybe you're more likely to support various companies that have sponsorship deals with your team over maybe a rival company. So it's something for some of the diehard fans to think about.
Yeah, and I definitely think that there's an edge to having a, we'll say, home state team when they sponsor one of these teams where it's a sense of try for people where they are able to see, for example, Yingling beer is a huge one in Pennsylvania. And when you see that everywhere and you watch these games, it's like a broader market. It is marketing, but it's able to cast the net a little bit wider and it's on one of the larger stages if it's something that's nationally broadcasted. So, with that, we can see how these events will impact the economy. But what about things on a more personal level? Are there certain strategies that are, or theories maybe, that are associated with sports events and their stocks as they look to cause ripple effects sometimes in the stock market? We just came out of a Super Bowl that can impact things in different ways. March Madness is coming up, or even like Olympics. I know that can usually be on a scale where we're looking at what place it's in. But how exactly would we see it from the financial market perspective?
Yeah, I'll stick with the Olympics first, since you mentioned that one recently. The Olympics right now, media rights here in the US, NBC and Peacock. Peacock is their streaming platform. They were able to get a ton of subscribers for Peacock after this last Olympics because they did 24/7 coverage there. When these Olympics are happening in different time zones, it's really hard to get all those events into primetime coverage here in the US. So people are looking for that. I want to watch this live. I want to be able to know who wins. I don't want to have to wait until the 8 o'clock primetime coverage. So people are subscribing for these streaming platforms to get access. And also worth noting, NBC actually has the rights to the next Super Bowl in 2026. And they have the Winter Olympics and they have the NBA All Star Game. So in the month of February, they're now going to have three major events that they can package these advertising deals, do some streaming exclusives. You mentioned the economies, right? When we have the World Cup, which happens every 4 years, wherever those World Cups are, sometimes stocks in that region see a little bit of a boost, right? When it happened in Brazil, it happened in South Africa. And sometimes the same for the winning nation that wins the World Cup. If a Brazil wins, there's parties on the streets, right? Investors go look and they're like, hey, who are the local beer companies in Brazil? Who are the hospitality companies? Who are the trickle down beneficiaries of this World Cup victory? And I think you can say that kind of about every sport, but some of these international competitions like the Olympics, the World Series happen every 4 years. Maybe it's got a bigger impact on some of those stocks.
Yeah, and the Olympics can sometimes is a good example. That can sometimes yield up to 500,000 new people embarking to go to these places, and that can really impact their tourism revenue and then also those companies if they are public, how they're going to expand or if they're going to see a spike in growth or a steady spike in growth. But When you start to look at adding any of these stocks where they're aligned with a sport or maybe adjacent to a sport, what are some things to keep in mind? Because some of them may have a cultural base of interest that may limit its growth, or maybe it's something a little bit trendier, etc.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things I mentioned before was those team ownership stocks, right? You could be a fan of a team and maybe your team is not publicly traded. So it's, hey, I want exposure to the baseball sector, but I don't like the Atlanta Braves. Am I going to invest in the Atlanta Braves stock when my team plays them? Who do I root for then? Do I root for the stock I own or do I root for my favorite team? So there's a little bit of a conflict of interest there when that culture comes in a little bit. We also see trends like you mentioned. Golf stocks were for a while when Tiger Woods was playing. Once he stopped and wasn't at the top of his game and took a step back, a lot of these golf stocks dropped off in interest level because golf didn't have as many of the big names. Now you have the Live Golf versus PGA Tour battle going. There's people maybe staying away from that different industry instead of getting in there before. You have this rise of pickleball lately, right? So people are looking, hey, what are some of the trends with pickleball? Who makes pickleball paddles? Who owns some of these courts? Is there a way to invest in that? But then in the back of your mind, it's always, how long is this going to last for? Is this a short-term trend? Is this a long-term trend? Something to be thinking about as well.
Yeah, and as we start to head into the summer, or at least the spring on the East Coast, but you go a little bit more south, it gets warmer quicker. Are you noticing any types of trends, or there are maybe seasonal trends that come along with these stocks? I mentioned Bale earlier. There's some environmental constraints now, as some winters aren't lasting as long.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a huge factor. You mentioned Vail Resorts, publicly traded, your ski resorts. We've got plenty here in Michigan and summer stocks as well, right? Like how long do some of these seasons last? That can also impact your hospitality industry, your hotels with some of these sports leagues. I think one of the bigger trends we're starting to see too in the world of sports on the nature of the weather is a lot of these massive stadiums that are being built, whether it's in Europe for soccer or for NFL here in the US, they're enclosed roofs, right? Indoor stadiums. If you're a team in the Midwest, it used to be an advantage to have an outdoor stadium. Teams have to come play you in the playoffs in the snow, but we're starting to see less of that. And I think a lot of it has to do with the ownership groups, right? Because if you have an indoor stadium, you can also book concerts year long. You can book other sporting events year long, right? You're not just worried about those 8 home NFL games. So I think that the environment and the weather is also having a huge impact on some of those decisions that are being made as well. We also have the unfortunate disasters that happen time to time, the the wildfires in California, hurricanes in Florida. Sometimes you see these sporting events that then have to be moved, right, to other cities. We had an NFL playoff game that had to be moved from California to Arizona due to the wildfires. You have some of these games that get delayed or postponed. During COVID, we saw the NBA play a whole season in the bubble. So all their home games were played in Florida. So that impacted a ton of these local restaurants and hotels, and then also the stadiums that also have the games normally where fans can come and pay for tickets.
Yeah, there's definitely a need, I think, with whether it's interest from the people watching or environmental changes. There's definitely a need for a little bit more of a diversification of what's on your schedule for these stadiums. I mentioned farm teams or minor league teams throughout the country. They're usually not just dedicated to the local hockey or the local baseball team. They usually have about 5 to 10 other events throughout the year to be able to consistently make income for the surrounding area and that small economy, but also to justify the ginormous, they're usually pretty big buildings and stadiums that are now in that town. Since we're coming right out of the Super Bowl over the past weekend, Was there anything that you noticed that was an initial impact out of that? Maybe some of the key players that were in the big advertising spots? Or is it more like keeping an eye on it from the Super Bowl to March Madness to see how sports stocks are performing as we start to go into, I guess you could say, baseball season?
Yeah, one of the weird things out there is the Super Bowl indicator, which is this kinda made up from 1978 by a sports writer who decided, "Hey, if an NFC team wins the Super Bowl, the stock market fares better," and that was based on research done the years before that, and for a while, it proved true for several decades where NFC team won, it was better for the stock market. In recent years, when an AFC team wins, it actually is good for the stock market as well. The one thing I would point out, yourself a Phillies fan, I don't know if you want to hear this, but the last couple times a team from Philadelphia has won a major sporting event, so like a World Series or a Super Bowl, it's actually been followed by kind of some economic disasters. So obviously not saying that will happen this time around, but it's one of these things where people look at these trends, right? And I even saw one that said if the Chiefs or the Eagles won by 20 or more points, it would be better for the stock market, right? They ended up winning by 18. So, how does that impact the stock market? So it's fun to play around with some of these different past trends and historical averages for the S&P 500 based on who wins and who's in the Super Bowl.
Yes, I have heard, unfortunately, about the Philly impact, if you will, after they win a title here and there. The last time that they won the World Series, yeah, it was followed by a little bit of a tough few years, but definitely interesting to hear all the different theories and strategies that come around these, we'll say, like the major sport holidays, if you will, throughout the year, the Super Bowl, March Madness, World Series, etc., as they impact the stock market and portfolios. If you're investing, especially in discretionary type of stocks, because as you noted, there's definitely a speculation element or a fandom element, but then also the thing America's most famous for, the consumption element of how much people are consuming around sports and the associated media and products. But you brought up some awesome points today. Thanks so much for joining us, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. So, as always, listeners can learn more about an array of financial topics for free at interactivebrokers.com/campus. Feel free to leave us a rating or review. Thanks for listening, everyone.
The analysis in this material is provided for information only and is not and should not be construed as an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to buy any security. To the extent that this material discusses general market activity, industry, or sector trends, or other broad-based economic or political conditions, it should not be construed as research or investment advice. To the extent that it includes references to specific securities, commodities, currencies, or other instruments, those references do not constitute a recommendation by IBKR to buy, sell or hold such investments. This material does not and is not intended to take into account the particular financial conditions, investment objectives or requirements of individual customers. Before acting on this material, you should consider whether it is suitable for your particular circumstances and, as necessary, seek professional advice.